Hi, my fellow Elizabethtown seniors. My name is Lauren Seda, and for my senior research project, I decided to investigate U.S. gun policy and compare it to the gun policies of other developed nations. But before we get to those comparisons, I wanted to share some U.S. gun violence statistics with you. Many of these should not come as a surprise since the gun debate has been featured in the media a lot lately, but I just wanted to remind you of the problem that the U.S. is having currently with guns. So there are about 650 million civilian-owned guns in the world, and the United States owns almost half of those at 310 million. For every 100 Americans, there are 89 who have a firearm in the home. And the U.S. gun homicide rate is 25.2 times higher than any other developed nation, and the suicide by firearm rate is 8 times higher. This is a graphic that was featured in one of my sources, and I thought it was a good visual representation of the first statistic that I shared, so I wanted to share it with you. So with a gun homicide and suicide rate as high as the United States, I think it's important that we also look at where these deaths are occurring. The first being mass shootings. From 2009 to 2016, there were 156 mass shootings in the United States. 42% of the shooters exhibited red flag warning signs, and a red flag means that they were showing signs of violence, mental instability, or possibly a drug or alcohol issue. And 34% of these shooters were prohibited from possessing a firearm, which means there was some kind of protective order placed against them for some reason, saying that they were not safe and they were at risk and they should not have a firearm in their possession. Domestic violence is another major issue when it comes to firearms. 54% of mass shootings start as cases of domestic assault, and domestic assaults involving a firearm are 12 times more likely to result in homicide. And 4.5 million women report being threatened with a gun by a loved one. I actually found a quote really interesting in one of my sources. They said, "The only thing separating a battered woman and a murdered woman is a gun." That was kind of eye-opening and kind of sad, so I wanted to share that with you. And this is a graph, a table that was featured in one of my sources, breaking down our firearm homicide rate and non-firearm homicide and suicide rates in the U.S. in 2010. So you can see in the very bottom, in the third column to your right, that there were 14,000 firearm deaths in 2010 for 35 to 64-year-olds, and actually 31,000 per 100,000 population in 2010. So that's a lot. That's a lot of people dying by firearms, and you'll see that that's way higher than any of the other developed nations that I'm going to discuss. All right, so suicide. 21,000 Americans attempt suicide with a firearm each year, and 90% of them are successful. And when you look at suicide rates for other methods of suicide, the statistic actually reverses. Only 10% are successful when they're using a method like hanging or drug overdose. And 90% of the 90% who are unsuccessful will not attempt suicide again. And then 500 children each year attempt suicide with a gun that is found in their home. And the presence of a gun in the home triples the risk of suicide. And this rate is actually 7 times, the risk of suicide is 7 times higher during the first year that a gun is in the home. And then gang violence. 90% of all gang-related homicides are committed with a gun. And this was about 770 murders in the 5-year span of 2003 to 2008. And most gang-related murders only occur because a gun is present. They're normally arguments between gangs that are then escalated because a gun is there, or they're retaliatory violence. Typically, they're not actually crime-related like many of us may think. So why are so many gun deaths happening in the U.S.? Why do we seem to be very gun out of control compared to other developed nations? Well, that's because U.S. policy is kind of lax compared to other countries, and we do have some loopholes in our policies. So first, we've had little change over the last 75 years. There's only really 3 major firearm policies in U.S. history. The first being the Federal Firearms Act of